There is a mystic surrounding intelligence agencies, and the CIA is no exception. From covert operations to classified documents, the agency has a history shrouded in secrecy. Today, we're going to see the most horrifying secrets that CIA was hiding from the public. The MK-Ultra Project. The MK-Ultra Project was an illegal human experimentation program designed and undertaken by the CIA and intended to develop procedures and identify drugs that could be used during interrogations to awaken people and force confessions through brainwashing and psychological torture. It began in 1953 and was held in 1973. MK-Ultra used numerous methods to manipulate its subjects' mental states and brain functions, such as the covert administration of high doses of physioactive drugs, especially LSD, and other chemicals, without the subject's consent. Electroshocks, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, verbal and sexual abuse, and other forms of torture. MK-Ultra was preceded by Project Artichoke. It was organized through the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence and coordinated with the United States Army Biological Warfare Laboratories. The program engaged in illegal activities, including the use of US and Canadian citizens as unwitting test subjects. MK-Ultra's scope was broad, with activities carried out under the guise research at more than 80 institutions aside from the military, including colleges and universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies. The CIA operated using front organizations, although some top officials at these institutions were aware of the CIA's involvement. MK-Ultra was revealed to the public in 1975 by the Church Committee of the United States Congress and Gerald Ford's United States President's Commission on CIA Activities within the United States. Investigative efforts were hampered by CIA Director Richard Hertz's order that all MK-Ultra files be destroyed in 1973. The Church Committee and Rockefeller Commission investigations relied on the sworn testimony of direct participants and on the small number of documents that survived Helm's order. In 1977, a Freedom of Information Act request uncovered a cache of 20,000 documents relating to MK-Ultra, which led to Senate hearings. The Phoenix Operation. The Phoenix program was designed and initially coordinated by the CIA during the Vietnam War, involving the American, Australian, and South Vietnamese militaries. In 1969, CIA responsibility was phased out and the program was put under the authority of the Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support of the CORDS. The program, which lasted from 1967 to 1972, was designed to identify and destroy the Viet Cong via infiltration, assassination, torture, capture, counter-terrorism, and interrogation. The CIA described it as a set of programs that sought to attack and destroy the political infrastructure of the Viet Cong. The Phoenix program was premised on the idea that North Vietnamese infiltration had required local support within non-combat civilian populations, which were referred to as the VC infrastructure and political branch that had purportedly coordinated the insurgency. Throughout the program, Phoenix neutralized 740,000, almost 82,000 people suspected of VC membership, of whom almost 27,000 were killed, and the rest surrendered. Of those killed, 87% were attributed to conventional military operations by South Vietnamese and American forces, while the remaining 13% were attributed to Phoenix program operatives. The Phoenix program was heavily criticized on various grounds. Shortly after the 1954 and the adoption of the Geneva Accords, the government of North Vietnam organized a force of several thousand to mobilize support for the communists in the upcoming elections. When it became clear that the elections would not take place, these forces became the seeds of what would eventually become the Viet Cong, a North Vietnamese insurgency whose goal was unification of Vietnam under the control of the North. While counter-insurgency efforts had been ongoing Since the first days of US military involvement in Vietnam, they had been unsuccessful with dealing with either the armed component Viet Cong or the Viet Cong civilian infrastructure, which swelled to between 80,000 and 150,000 members by the mid-60s. The civilians, unlike the armed component of the Viet Cong, was tasked with support activities, including recruiting, indoctrination, psychological operations, intelligence collection, and logistical support. The Vietnamese civilians rapidly set up shadow governments in small rural hamlets loyal to the Saigon government with communist cadres. They chose small rural villages because they lacked close supervision of the Saigon government or the South Vietnamese army. Their tactics in establishing local communist control began by identifying towns and villages to either the Viet Cong or the People's Army of Vietnam, the South Vietnamese army, and local populations with communist sympathies with the Hanoi government, putting a great deal of emphasis on the activities and success of the VCI. After a community was identified, the VCI would threaten local leadership with reprisals if they refused to cooperate, or kidnap local leaders and send them to re-education camps in North Vietnam. Local leaders who continued to refuse to cooperate or threatened to contact the Saigon government were murdered, along with their families. After VCI agents took control of an area, it would be used to quarter and resupply Viet Cong guerrillas, supplying intelligence on US and South Vietnamese army movements, providing taxes to VCI cadres, and conscripting locals into the Viet Cong. The Guatemala Syphilis Experiment. The Guatemala Syphilis Experiments were United States-led human experiments conducted in Guatemala from 1946 to 1948. The experiments were led by physician John Charles Cutler, who also participated in the late stages of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Doctors infected 1,300 people, including at least 600 soldiers, and people from various improvised groups, such as sex workers, orphans, inmates of mental hospitals, and prisoners, with syphilis, gonorrhea, and downright, without the informed consent of the subjects. Only 700 of them received treatment. In total, 5,500 people were involved in all research experiments, of whom 83 died by the end of 1953, though it is unknown whether or not the inoculations were responsible for all these deaths. Serology studies continued through 1953, involving the same vulnerable populations, in addition to children from state-run schools and orphans and rural towns, though the international infection of patients ended with the original study. On October 1, 2010, the US President and Secretary of Health and Human Services formally apologized to Guatemala for the ethical violations that took place. Guatemala condemned the experiment as a crime against humanity. Multiple unsuccessful lawsuits have since been filed in the US. The initial attempts to infect subjects of the experiment consisted of workers from the US PHS inoculating prostitutes with germs that had grown in rabbits and then paying them to have sex with prisoners. Prostitutes in Guatemala were required to be tested twice a week for STD infection at a government clinic. For the purposes of the experiments, infected sex workers were instead sent to Dr. Cutler by the head of the Guatemalan Ministry of Public Health. In 1947, Cutler began experimenting with gonorrhea on Guatemalan soldiers. About 600 soldiers were infected with the disease after a year and a half. Infected sex workers were used to infect the soldiers, and gonorrheal pus from soldiers' penises were injected into other soldiers. Sunroad experiments were also conducted simultaneously on about 80 soldiers, in which doctors would scratch soldiers' arms and infect the wounds. Consent was given by soldiers' officials or patient doctors, but was not reported to have been given by the subjects themselves. A documented subject profile provides a detailed description of what the subjects faced within this experiment. Berta was a female patient in the psychiatric hospital. In February 1948, Berta was injected in her left arm with syphilis. A month later, she developed scabies, an itchy skin infection caused by a mite. Several weeks later, Dr. Cutler noted that she also developed red bumps where she had injected her arm, lesions on her arm and legs, and her skin was beginning to waste away from her body. Berta was not treated for syphilis until 3 months after her injection. Soon after, on August 23, Dr. Cutler wrote that Berta appeared as if she was going to die, but he did not specify why. That same day, he put gonorrhea pus from another male subject into both of Berta's eyes, as well as in her urethra and rectum. He also reinfected her with syphilis. Several days later, Berta's eyes were filled with pus from the gonorrhea and she was bleeding from her urethra. 3 days later, on August 27, Berta died. The Operation Condor was a United States-backed campaign of political repression and state terrorism involving intelligence operations, CIA-backed coups, as well as assassinations of left-wing and socialist leaders in South America from 1968 to 1989. Operation Condor was officially and formally implemented by the right-wing dictatorships of the southern cone of South America. Due to its clandestine nature, the precise number of deaths directly attributable to Operation Condor is highly disputed. Some estimates are that at least 60,000 deaths can be attributed to Condor, with up to 30,000 of these in Argentina. Although it was described by the CIA as a cooperative effort by the intelligence security services of several South American countries to combat terrorism and subversion, combating guerrillas was used as a pretext for its existence, as guerrillas were not substantial enough in numbers to control territory, gain material support by any foreign power, or otherwise threaten national security. Condor's initial members were the governments of Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia. Brazil signed the agreement later on. The United States government provided planning, coordinating, training on torture, and technical support, and supplied military aid to the juntas during the Ford, Carter, and Reagan administrations. Such support was frequently routed through the CIA. Thanks for watching, subscribe so you won't miss more exciting videos coming in the future.